Ammara, thank you so
Yes,
much for taking the time out.
no, that's okay. I'm sorry I was late. Things just always run longer than they should.
I understand. Thank you. So, Ammara, just at the beginning first, if you can please tell me a little bit about the synopsis of your insights into Pakistani society as it stands today.
Um, okay, just to give a little bit context to what I'm saying, I'm basing this a lot on what my academic interest is, which is in middle class Pakistan, urban middle class Pakistan. Most of my prior work was based largely on Lahore's middle class, although now it's expanded more to Karachi as well. So when I say the Pakistani middle class, either I'm really just referring to Lahore or if I kind of mention it in relation to Karachi. So I'm just a bit careful about, I don't want this to be generalized as, this is what all of Pakistani society is like, but a huge proportion of what I would say the urban emerging middle class is like. And what I've largely talked about in my book also is that, there's a narrative through which urban Pakistan and religious change is understood in Pakistan, which we say that something very wrong happened in Zia's Islamization period, right? And I think something very wrong did happen, but using that narrative to then explain why is it that now we have this very strong religious bent in our middle class, it doesn't explain the full picture. Because, it's 10 years, right? We can say things, Spain was under Islamic rule for like 1,000 years. Nothing significant changed. And so part of my work has been to understand why is it that we have a middle class that's more religious than what was assumed, or is religious in a particular kind of way, right? And I have kind of placed that religiosity in relation to what's happening internationally in terms of religious change and Islamic piety in relation to development of a personal self. So how do you become a good and modern Muslim? Mm-hmm. And then also how it plays out in class politics in emerging middle classes, like how do they build social capital, show some kind of public morality that challenges the established middle class in their eyes, right? Which is perhaps a much smaller group that became more established during the 1950s or 60s. And I want to add, this whole thing that we talk about, something bad happened with Zia's time. I'm not discounting that, but obviously some seeds of that were there much before that. So kind of to talk about particular periods in Pakistan's time is like those were more secular or less secular. I feel really hides what was happening in relation to how a Muslim identity was being built in relation to being modern or being a Pakistani.
Okay. No, this is interesting because I always also question, I've studied a little bit and, talked to a few people also previously for a project that I was doing. That, and people have told me of accounts before Zia's time, and we like to put all the blame on Zia's time because it's in our memory. We have lived through that time, most of us. So, but before that, even even right after partition, and even before partition, there was a whole shift that we saw on how Muslim League's politics, sort of aligned itself. So, talk a little bit about that. And do you think that that impetus, that seed of religious identity and looking for your identity within a religious fold became part of Pakistan's genesis?
I don't want to say that this was it, right? Like it's that this was the only way Pakistan could have gone because this is how it happened. But I think that this nexus between being Muslim and being Pakistani came a particular way. When I was saying to you about, I think that things had started much before, I was in my mind at that time when I was saying it, I was referring to things like the MD crisis, right? Like we can't just put the blame on Zia, for instance, for that. So issues of when we think about how blasphemy is taken off in a very particular kind of way now, and obviously the kind of constitutional lack of constitutional protection that's there, we can take it back to 1973. But the seeds of like the MD issue is much before, right? It's in fact there. But just to kind of answer what you were saying slightly differently, what you're saying, that we lived through a particular time, and of course you're right, and you see changes happening. Yeah, like मेरे अम्मी अब्बू मुझे सारा कहते थे जब हम मेडिकल कॉलेज में होते थे कोई भी हिजाब नहीं पहनता था, अब सब हिजाब पहन के बैठे हुए हैं, right? And obviously because उनके जमाने में the urban public sphere बहुत छोटा था, like, and आपके मेडिकल कॉलेज में आपके जानने वाले बच्चे जाते थे. So what we actually see as a very strong religious visible presence also has to do with a certain kind of democratization, right? That people of different classes can make it to medical college. You might not like it because it's not exactly the kind of social milieu you want to belong in. And that has to do with a lot of where the memory is filtered, right? So when we look at pictures of the past and you kind of see, oh, there was jazz on Mall Road in a hotel and so on. It's exactly where it was. It was on Mall Road in that one club, and very few people could visit it. And similarly for Karachi, and in fact, similarly for like photos you see of Kabul pre Taliban taking over, that was very liberal. I'm not doubting that at all, but it was in no way representative of all of Afghanistan, right?
Sure.
So I think that what's mixed into this, to go back to what you're saying, is that yes, there was elite politics that played out a particular way in which it had a particular modernist idea of being Muslim, but it was very contested, right? And when all of these different groups come in with their own ideas about what it means to be Muslim, and it's constantly changing in conversation with each other, with what's happening outside of Pakistan, it's very hard to kind of give this predictable trajectory of this is what should have happened and this is what happened,
Mm-hmm. No, but then again, if we go back even further and we talk about, how Islam spread in this part of the world, we know of, how often it's talked about, that the Sufis brought it, and Sufism and the whole, that spiritual line had a role to play in it. But then if we look at it from the social lens, then we see that kind of pluralism or inclusivity ceased to exist somewhere down the line, And again, I'm looking at it from a social perspective, not necessarily from how the political things unfolded.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I would perhaps just add like maybe 2 or 3 caveats. One of which is that plurality and animosity can exist together, right? So people of different communities can have certain ways of mixing, and then a certain they say actually this crossed the line or apun kharaba hoga, which is something that explodes in partition, right? That the violence that you see around partition, because you can't say this violence came out of nowhere, but it also just comes out of somewhere, right? So I think that one of the things we need to do is not think of, and that's some of the more recent work that I'm now doing, is to not kind of see plurality and animosity not to be opposite ends of the spectrum. You could have a mixture of two happening all the time. But you are right that we see a certain kind of crystallization of identities, right? And we can take it back to, like, I guess historians have done that. They've taken it back to colonial censuses that fixed particular religious identities on particular people. When you attach voting rights and representation to it, it becomes even more crystallized and important, and the stakes get much higher. And in that way, you don't see the same kind of crossovers that you used to see before. And I mean, finally, and I think this is something that's also worth tapping into, we like to kind of think of, and I think this is quite parallel to the whole Zia narrative, that it's like the Deobandi, Wahhabis, Islam that is bad, but like the Sufis are great guys. And yes, it's true. But also there's not as if there haven't been Sufi silsilas which have taken up jihad or are violent, or particularly when you see this whole kind of shift towards blasphemy, it doesn't come as much from the kind of Deobandi or reformist quarters as it does from the more Sufi-oriented one, right? Like Dawat-e-Islami, where Mumtaz Qadri used to go, is hardly a reformist Islam kind of organization. So it's I think what would be helpful to think about is perhaps where plurality can exist and where it can't, right? And so when does it become an issue? So I mean, I'm more recently doing work with Hindus from Thar Parker who have come into Karachi and are living there, life in Thar and so on. And it seems like Muslims and Hindus interact a lot in Thar, for instance, right? But there is a point at which things get bloody, and that is on the issue of intermarriage, right?
Okay.
And and that's also very big in terms of forced marriages. It's not just about Muslims and Hindus getting married. Even Hindus outside of their community, it becomes a very big issue to marry, right? So it seems like there are issues on which you can cross over, but then there are issues in which there's not going to be no crossing over and there'd be violence. So I'm quite interested in now thinking about those kind of dynamics, that how far can you go, and like what are the rules on which to engage.
You in your discussion mentioned and about the idea of a modern, progressive, inclusive Muslim society. Do we have parallels? I mean, usually I talk about Far East and how they have reached a happy place where kind of they have, with their cultural identity and the legacy identity that they were carrying, they have sort of found a balance with their adopted religion. How do you look at Pakistan society in that perspective?
I mean, I guess you're right. On the face of it, the Far East feels that way, but it's come with a lot of kind of dictatorial control, right? And sort of very populist governments in some ways. I mean, it's kind of hard to kind of make that kind of argument for Pakistan in terms of saying, oh, things are hunky-dory, or like there's a certain kind of peace with one's identity. But one thing that I have really felt is that there's a lot more room for discussion and debate about identity, about religious identity, than we often give credit to, right? Like we only discuss it at the point of when there's violence, but we don't discuss it at the points where there's no violence. And I would like to talk about it in relation to, I'm just giving some examples of it, but you could, extrapolate it in different things. I mean, the way that religious or like movements have proliferated in Pakistan, you can see like, and the families that I work with, which are like emerging middle class families, there's going to be one brother who has joined the Tablighi Jamaat, लेकिन उनके दूसरे भाई जो हैं वो जमात इस्लामी का हिस्सा होंगे. किसी ने कभी जमात इस्लामी छोड़ के तबलीगी जमात ज्वाइन कर ली, किसी ने थोड़ी देर जमात और दावा के लिए भी कुछ काम किया, किसी ने कुछ किया. So what I'm saying is that अगर आप एक गवर्नमेंट यूनिवर्सिटी में पढ़े हुए हैं, आपका ताल्लुक बहुत ज्यादा रिलीजियस ऑर्गेनाइजेशन से होता है, एट सम पॉइंट आपका किसी ना किसी से कोई ताल्लुक जरूर हुआ होगा, राइट? Whether you kept it or not. And similarly, if you kind of work in a government sector, if you kind of work in, a lot of them have their own choti businesses, just if wherever they are working, you come into contact with these different religious organizations, right? And at different points in your life, you are more attuned to some than others in your own views. And which means is that actually there's a lot of disagreement in your family, right? Everyone's Musliman. Nobody's gone outside the daira of Musliman.
No, of course.
But like kaun kis taraf kitna zyada gaya becomes like a big issue of debate and contention at family gatherings and so on. And if you particularly add to the mix how many khawateen are encouraged to go to Al-Huda in these middle class circles. But then after they've gone to Al-Huda, it's not as if they have great choice to say कि अब हमने अपने फलाने cousin से शादी नहीं करनी, right? Even Al-Huda wouldn't support them, by the way, in doing that. So then you might have these very reformist Islam predilection, लेकिन आपकी शादी तो आपके बरेलवी cousin से हुई है, right? और आपकी सास आपके घर में मिलाद भी करती हैं और सब कुछ, and you have to make do with it. And in all of these, like I'm giving these very micro examples, but these are micro examples of engagement with religious difference, right?
But within the circle of Islam.
Within the circle of Islam. But there is a lot of debate and contestation and arguments going on. People change. आप कभी किसी से बात नहीं करते, लेकिन फिर आप करते हैं, शुरू कर देते हैं, right? So I don't really want to make this into a hopeful picture because, like you're saying, this is all within the ambit of Islam.
Yeah.
And this is all within the ambit of the two things that you do disagree, everyone agrees on in all of these sects is that एक तो अगर आपने कभी भी तौहीन रिसालत की तो आप वाजिबुल कत्ल हैं, right? There's disagreement on everything. Like
we have seen Barelvis doing very very stark things in recent history.
Yeah, but one thing that you don't disagree on is Tawheen Risalat, and uske andar, maybe you disagree on and you agree on MDs not being Muslims. Like, I would say these are the two core issues. But uske alawa, there is a lot of debate and discussion and agreement and change over time, right? So I don't want to present this as a hopeful picture, because like I'm saying, there's limited room within it. But on the other hand, there's so much room for change and debate and how to handle what is happening. And किसी ने अपने भाई से बात नहीं की कि फिर 5 साल बाद कुछ और हो गया. So what I'm trying to say is that as your life moves on, things change in your life and things change in how you relate to others. And those things are not crystallized by आपने अगर तबलीगी जमात join कर ली तो अब हमेशा ही तबलीगी है, right? Or you don't make these allowances. And I feel a lot of our narratives of violence and Islam in Pakistan, which are there, I'm not denying them at all, really miss this picture, right? Because if everyone was breaking out into violence, there'd be no family left together in these circles, right? But like things continue.
But, let's add the other, qualifier that you have in your research, and that's middle class. So let's talk a little bit about that. This is, I would think this is based on economic status of a family in Pakistan's economy.
Yes, more or less. I would say economic status mixed in a little bit with aspirations of how you want to live and how you want others to perceive how you live. Okay. It's very hard for us to do a very typical kind of middle class analysis in Pakistan of saying, well, like a typical example, like a typical English dictionary like definition of a middle class would be people who neither own property, right, nor do they work with their hand ke wo kheton mein kaam nahi karte hai. So that's like that bit in the middle, right? And it's very hard to kind of say this for the Pakistani middle class because people don't have very one set form of income. And that has to do with the precarious economy that they exist. And there was a time, and actually a lot of colonial historians would say this, that the South Asian middle class is linked to government employment. Agar aap sarkar ke liye kaam karte ho, to aap middle class ho, right? Like the Hamza Alvi used to call it the salaried classes. But the thing is that when you start doing fieldwork, it's really hard to find that group. And I say this because if you look at a typical family that's middle class, it's true that aspiration aapki hai कि आप सरकार के आप गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर में नौकरी करो, पर अब आपको गवर्नमेंट सेक्टर की नौकरी पे ऐसे पैसे नहीं मिलते कि आपके बच्चे एक प्राइवेट स्कूल में पढ़ सकें, उनकी शाम को ट्यूशनें भी हों, वो वीकेंड पे मैकडॉनल्ड्स भी चले जाएं. That's the aspirational bit of being middle class, right? That you're seen to do all of these things. And so you need to augment your income somewhere. So typically what I've seen is that एक भाई करता होगा गवर्नमेंट में काम, लेकिन बाकी भाइयों का कोई साइड पे जनरेटर का भी बिजनेस होगा जिसमें इनका भी हिस्सा होगा. Someone else might have gone to Dubai, not as a construction worker, but like as a mobile retailer or something like this. At a certain point, they were also going to Malaysia, actually. And at the same time, they're buying and selling files as a, urban property becomes a way. So it's very hard to say, oh, unki zameen nahi hai, unke paas zameen hai. It's, literally nahi hai, file hai. So it's hard to kind of make that economic case of like, these are the government employed places, so they get their income from various sources. And us tarah mein aspirational makes it much easier, right? That you can say, okay, yes, they have typically these kind of varied sources. It's probably a generation जो कि खुद government universities, public sector universities से पढ़ के निकली है, लेकिन उनके बच्चे जो हैं अब वो private schools में जाते हैं, not in like your, I don't know, like the best private school that they might go to is the Educators, or maybe someone goes to Beacon House or something, but like not the kind of elite private schools, I guess. And there's a lot of investment in education for bachon ke school, but also like everyone goes to a tuition academy dopahr mein, sham mein. I'm seeing a lot of joint family living. That's a lot of what my recent work is now going to be on, that the way that you kind of get a middle class lifestyle is to live in a joint family system, which again doesn't really follow that modernist middle class narrative, right? That you become nuclear family and you kind of make it yourself. Karachi mein zyada hai because of the way people live. Flats mein, usme you can't endlessly build a portion upar, kamra upar. But there's definitely a lot of joint family living in this kind of middle class that allows for then spending on items like these kind of बच्चों को आप weekend पे McDonald's के play area में लेकर and that kind of stuff.
And do you see, what kind of differences did you see between this aspirational middle class that you're talking about in Lahore and then in Karachi? It's just a side question, but just came to my mind. But must be interesting.
I mean, like people always say that. I mean, and it is true that Lahore is definitely much smaller than Karachi. Like Lahore is far bigger than people imagine it to be. But Lahore is quite flat, right? Like by flat, I mean that it's not ethnically and linguistically as diverse as Karachi.
Right.
But one of the things I want to add in that is that there is something particular about Lahore in which ethnic differences or community differences kind of fizzle out very quickly also. So I see a lot of intermarriages happening in Lahore between different different zaats, which jo aapko Karachi mein is in some ways a lot more cosmopolitan living, but on the other hand, it's a very community-based living. I like Delhi wale sirf Delhi walon mein shaadi karenge. Unke areas bhi farak hai, unki bakeries bhi farak hai, unke restaurants bhi farak hai. It's for you to dip into these different communities feels very cosmopolitan, right? Like, aap Lahore mein kab kisi Parsi se milenge, aap Lahore mein kab kisi Hindu se milenge.
Right.
But on the other hand, and obviously there's interaction that they have through work, but largely life is so community organized in Karachi, like outside again of these very elite circles, right? I'm talking about the middle class circles. That it, Karachi is more cosmopolitan, but it's not cosmopolitan in the sense that people are not driven by community. In fact, I would say community plays a larger role in your middle class life. And uska chalo ek positive baat ye hai that it's not overarchingly just religious, right? Like the big identity that comes out in Lahore as you become middle class is religious. Whereas in Karachi, I feel like it's undercut by a lot of kind of community identity as well, whether you're Bori or you're Sindhi or
So are you saying that, that way Karachi's middle class is less inclined for divisive ideas based on religion than Lahore?
I mean, maybe that's saying it very strongly, but perhaps what I'm saying is that there are other divisive things in Karachi as well, right? So in some ways, it takes the starkness of the religious divisiveness away. And particularly outside of Urdu-speaking Muhajir Karachi, there the religious kind of thing is very strong.
Yeah.
Whereas in Lahore, I really feel like other identities fizzle in comparison to this kind of religious identity. And in a way, Punjab has always been, or the heartlands of Punjab have always been like this, right? That invaders have come from all parts of the world and kind of just settled because it's lush and it's good and it's and something, the remnants of that still kind of exist in Lahore in that sense, that ethnic identities fizzle out quite quickly. And you can even see it. I mean, some of it has to do with the partition politics also, right? Like Urdu-speaking groups that have moved from Urdu-speaking parts of India into Punjab rarely call themselves Muhajir. They'll say, "Hi, I'm Urdu-speaking," but like that Muhajir identity is very Karachi-based.
Yeah. So I have another theory on this, and I would like to bounce it off you, and that is, because of the bloody partition that Punjab witnessed, I feel that Punjabis have a more aggressive approach towards their religious identity than any other provinces. And then, yes, you're right that the Urdu-speaking Muhajirs who actually settled in Karachi in a very engineered, ghettoed situation also sort of picked that up, in at some level. But the others we see, people who didn't see that kind of a bloody divide between, Balochistan wasn't divided, didn't see that kind of bloodshed, or even for that matter, KP and Sindh also, they didn't hold on to that strong religious identity that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth in what you're saying, that particularly in relation to kind of the Muhajir or Urdu-speaking population. It's also that they've lost their link to, I mean, the three things that have happened together, right? They've lost their link to their land.
Yeah.
How do they like, who are they?
Yeah.
They've also given up the most for this idea of Pakistan. And then, like, how is it that they build a sense of togetherness? So those, and that's, I think, some recent work on the early years of Pakistan has kind of discussed this, that, you know, they didn't have that kind of natural link to the land. And that shows up in the politics of the Muslim League after partition, because most of them were people who didn't come from the areas that became Pakistan. But all of that said, I think that there is something about religious fervor and religious identity in Punjab that predates partition. I'm not an expert on it. You can speak to people who work on the history of Punjab, but I think it's an area where these things, perhaps it has to do with the amount of religious groups that were here. I mean, I'm just speculating, but I definitely think that there is something peculiar about Punjab in terms of that religious fervor. I mean, and now when I do field work in Karachi with people who come from Thar Park, like, Sindh is completely different, right? And I do want to say that one of the reasons why Sindh feels very different in relation to religious minorities, particularly, is most of them are there, but also, like, Sindh had a very entrenched upper class Hindu presence, right? And a lot of them didn't leave at partition. And the legacy of that kind of continues, and also how they're engaged with PPP in their politics, and particularly after how the electorates have changed. That means that PPP needs to appeal to the Hindu vote to win, right? And in Punjab, you don't have that kind of entrenched upper class presence of religious minorities. And so I don't know how much of it just has to do with religious difference, but it also has to do with caste and community hierarchies that, you know, Pakistan has as much of in a different way than India.
But then, you know, we also often hear that the size of the middle class between Pakistan and India and how they define themselves, that is very, very different from each other, you know. How have you sort of delved into this phenomenon?
I mean, India is far bigger, right? And I think the middle classes in the two countries are often compared, and you're right. I don't think that the comparison is that valid. Partially because both the areas that are now Pakistan, the areas that are India, were very different at partition in terms of the amount of education and government infrastructure that was there to sustain a middle class urban life, right? Like, if you think about those Indian cities. And then also, since then, I think because of the way Indian politics have worked out, and particularly the kind of devolution that's present there, it's allowed for very particular kinds of regional middle class identities to come up, which isn't really the same for Pakistan either. I don't think that Pakistan has the same kind of regional middle classness as you would find in parts of India, but where they're similar, very much in terms of how modernity and being modern and being middle class is linked together, and the aspirational need to consume to show that you're middle class is very similar. And I would say, and just at a very kind of broad level, the kind of resurgence of Hinduism in the Indian middle classes, and the resurgence of kind of being a particular kind of Muslim in Pakistani middle class is similar, but I think that has to do with global trends rather than just something South Asian.
Okay. One other thing that, I find very fascinating is how the urban middle class Muslim Pakistani family and individuals, they also have a certain selectivism about, you know, how they apply this religious lens to different people and different situations. So, you know, like, for example, they may have a very hostile view of towards Shias, for that matter, if they are Sunnis, you know, and vice versa. I don't know, but you know, we see that, you know, they don't necessarily have that view of Khanis, for that matter. Do you think, you know, this is an interesting you know, insight into how religion affects people's view of other people?
I mean, yeah, but I think that what you're pointing towards is, particularly in relation to Sunnis and Shias in Pakistan, has to do with particular kinds of competition and conflict, right? Like Al Khanis are far too small a group, and also quite removed in the sense that unka nahi itna zyada interaction hota, right? Although, I mean, like, weren't they targeted in the bombings in Karachi that happened on? But I mean, you know, when we look at like kind of the work that's been done on the rise of Sunni Shia conflicts, by the way, there we can really very seriously blame Ziaul Haq also, because I think there was, you know, very clear links between funding of well, now Jaish-e-Mohammed, but like previous groups, particularly in the kind of geopolitical sense of Iran. The Iranian revolution might inspire Shias in Pakistan to want to do something similar, and therefore they must be pressed down. So we can see very strong kind of links with state-sponsored attacks on Shias at the time, right? Or like these feelings. But if you kind of go into the micro politics of why it was able to take hold, had to do with sort of very specific politics in South Punjab, right? That on the one hand, you had this landed Shia elite that owned all the land. On the other hand, you had the rise of like this bazaar-based traders who were all Sunni. And so there was a lot of economic competition between the two that then helped fuel these animosities, right? So again, not to take the blame away from what the state was doing, there's a particular reason that it took hold in South Punjab in particular ways, right? So if I'm to just say that if you extrapolate that to think about why not Al Khanis or wo, like when has there been that issue where I used to work for the AKCSP in Hunza, and Hunza ke andar there didn't used to be that kind of issue, but in Nagar there used to be some kind of issue between Shias and Sunnis, right?
Right.
And it had to do with, again, Sunnis doing, like, there being comparable communities to compete with each other, whereas in Hunza they were absent at the time.
Right.
And lastly, I think Sunnis and Shias is particularly problematic in Punjab because there's so much shared history, right? And then that shared history is now being separated into, this is a Sunni thing to do, this is a Shia thing to do. So when we were working on I mean, just to give you like a tiny anecdotal example, I was working with someone doing work on the kind of destruction that's happened because of the Orange Line in Lahore. And Anarkali was kind of a big place where the things were based, right? The destruction was based particularly around Mauj Daryas, Kamazar, which everyone talked about. But behind that was, you know, there was this whole controversy on एक इमाम बारगाह था जो कि बिक गया. अब वो बिका कैसे? इमाम बारगाह तो बिक नहीं सकता कि जिन लोगों ने बेचा उन्होंने कहा ये इमाम बारगाह नहीं था, उन्होंने कहा ये घर है, right? There were all these kind of rumors around it. And everyone who was kind of hearing that story, including myself, I was like, oh shit, they're going to be in trouble now, right? Like Imam Barga sab. And in a way it was like, you don't mess around with Hussein and Ali in those parts of right? And those are kind of very shared memories of a city. Those are very shared memories of being Sunni or Shia, which suddenly need to be separated into, is this a Sunni thing? Is this a Shia thing? So it's more fractious, right? Whereas that kind of shared history with Al Khanis, who are also Shia, by the way, doesn't exist in the same way it exists with the 12 Shias.
But then, you know, by the same logic, why is it that Ahmadis, just because of a law that was passed, became such a...
but is it just because of the law that was passed? It was prior to that too, right? Like MD protests have been going on before. I don't work on this, but I think that some of the kind of histories tracing the kind of really emotive potential of blasphemy is very strong in the MD case. But it's much older, right? It's much older than the law being passed in the 70s. It's much older than the riots in the 50s. Like we can go back towards the 1900s. Although MDs have also had a very elite presence in partition politics, right? And in fact, in the Constituent Assembly debates in Pakistan, the MD voices are quite strong. But you're right. I mean, now it's been entrenched to a point that it's part of state discourse. It's part of everyday discourse, right? Like, I don't think the Sunni Shia issue is as fractious as like just thinking whether you can let your child marry a Sunni if you're Shia or Shia if you're Sunni. That's conceivable in many ways, right? कि आप दोनों मौलवी से निकाह पढ़वा दो, आप ये कर दो. Like all these ways to kind of redo the damage that's done.
Right.
In this break. But you're right that this kind of and both sides, by the way, if you're amongst the MD community, it's very hard for you to break out and marry a Sunni or a Shia.
Okay. And then recently we have seen that, there is the issue of blasphemy, and the way it has surfaced again and again has become very, very contentious and very political. Why do you think there is so much? Was it always like this, or is it a recent phenomenon that it has become so profound?
I mean, I don't think it's come out of nowhere. I think it's always been a very emotive issue.
Even when we were living in one country, like the undivided India?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not something I work on, but all these people who do work on blasphemy kind of trace it way back, right? And it has to do with like the body of the prophet, the image of the prophet. And I mean, I can only say I would urge you to kind of think more in relation to that work. I'd be happy to pass on some of the references for it. But I think the reason why it's become particularly emotive in this era also has to do with the internationalness of blasphemy issues, right? That you can overlap them onto animosities and ideas about the West and how you then identify yourself against it. And so I think that particular issues that kind of come on top of each other that make it particularly more prone to outburst. And you can also link it to which other people have also done about just the rise of anger, the need for masculine politics, violence, all of that. But I don't think it is just a confluence of these things. I think blasphemy has always been a particular kind of issue, right? And we can even go into and people write about this now that, the blasphemy law was passed to protect religious minorities by the colonial authorities, right? And now it's being used the other way to oppress them, like kind of common. But the very fact that in the 1800s, the British had to pass a blasphemy law tells you that it was a particular kind of issue, right? So I think it predates, and obviously it's been exacerbated by the kind of religious politics we've had in our country that give it a particular leeway.
But this is again very particular to Southeast Asia, sort of.
Yeah, it is. Although, I mean, now that we see kind of protests in Europe around comics in the Netherlands
but again, that was going to be my next question, that now you live abroad and you have seen the diaspora middle class society, whatever little there is of that. Do you see the same sort of echoing, the same morality, the same religiosity?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say, right? I mean, in Britain, it's largely a Pakistani Muslim diaspora that dominates. And I think that there's, I mean, I think that the issues are quite different because it's an issue about being Muslim in a country that's not Muslim, right? And it also has to do with the background when you think about the Pakistani diaspora, that they come from not necessarily middle-class backgrounds in Pakistan, but then are trying to achieve a particular kind of status, which they haven't in Britain. So the issues, I think, that concern them are quite different. It's about existing as a particular kind of polity. But whether they're more becoming more religious, yes, and it has to do with consuming halal in a particular way, like that kind of modern Muslim identity is very much quite similar. So when I say that, when I was saying, blasphemy is quite big in Europe too. When I say in Britain, it's largely just Pakistani Muslim, British Muslims, right? And in fact, was it in Glasgow that an MD was killed for saying Eid Mubarak to a shop owner, right? So I mean, more people say that, agar unhe kisi ko UK asylum de de, I was like, yahan pe bhi wo aake mar sakte hain, there's no protection. But it feels like in Netherlands and France, where the Pakistani, it's not the Muslim diaspora is not Pakistani, it's largely Arab or it's Moroccan. Blasphemies become very big issues there too, right? And I think that has to do with the politics of the area, the kind of fight between secularism and religion. It's like issues over halal meat and so on. So it's become big there, but I don't think it's comparable with the same history.
Yeah. Interesting, because I did a project in UK for ITN. This was looking at the British Asian community and particularly British Pakistani community post 9/11. And there were riots in Bradford, and there were some people who were killed, and there were some neighborhoods which were declared Muslim neighborhoods, and the Goras couldn't come there after 7 p.m. And that kind of thing. So it was interesting to see at that time, and this is like 2008, 2009, that the kind of religious identity for British Pakistanis was on the rise, and everybody was like trying to get their head around what is happening. So that's a very interesting angle. Okay, tell me, what can we expect? What's coming up in the next 10 years for
I hate it when people ask me, like, मैं निजूमी हूँ, मुझे कैसे पता?
But कुछ projections, कुछ insights.
I mean, you mean in terms of politically or socially?
Both.
I mean, like, Pakistan politically, what can one say? It's like, yes, whoever. I mean, we all know who the people in charge is, right? When it comes to Pakistani politics, and I don't see that changing. Like, I don't see the military having any less of a hold on how Pakistani politics take hold. I guess what personally I'm more interested to see is that what I kind of see as this kind of discussion and debate amongst religious scholars in Pakistan, right? Or religious groups in Pakistan. How that continues to change the shape of religious groups in Pakistan. I'm not saying that they're going to disappear. I'm not saying that religion is going to be less. But I think that there's considerable room for movement and change that happens through different groups existing in the same space with each other. And so I think the interesting thing would be to see how all of that changes. And I guess we didn't really talk about this, but these kind of things that I was talking to you about, that, someone's Deoband, like, someone's very Wahhabi in their thinking, लेकिन अब उनकी सास घर में मिलाद करती है तो उन्हें तो जाना पड़ता है या उन्हें कोई बहाना बनाना पड़ता है. You can't challenge this. This is only in middle class settings that you deal with this kind of difference, right? If you're like upper middle class, urban in Pakistan, you don't actually deal with any difference. You don't deal with religious difference. Everyone agrees with you. You probably follow the same people on Twitter who agree with you. Like, actually your world ideologically is quite, everyone agrees with you on all things. But it's only in these kind of groups where there's engagement with difference, whether because religious, but also more and more I see ethnic engage. Like when I used to work with the Pashtuns who had left the tribal areas because of the drone attacks, they had to come in touch with Punjabi workers in Lahore where they work, right? Or they get in touch with Hindis, or they travel to different parts. So actually, in some ways, they're a lot more cosmopolitan because they engage with difference. If you're on the upper end of like the Pakistani, it's a spectrum, you're very cosmopolitan in your outlook, but in every day you don't have to engage with any difference, right? Or you can just shut it out. You can say, I disagree. And
just walk away.
Walk away. So I guess what for me in the next 10 years is very interesting, that this kind of engagement of differences that happens at this level, what it means for what changes and what it means to be a Muslim. Like, what are things that are going to fade? What are things that are going to come up? It's not going to remain static, right? So I guess that's what I would say for that.
And again, it is becoming more and more difficult to remain removed because we see more politics on the roads. We see a lot more on the media, social and conventional, media also. There's a lot of discussion and noise and expression that has found its way. So do you think, we are in any way heading towards a tipping point?
Like a tipping point for what?
A conflict, a large-scale conflict?
No, I don't really see that. I mean, I don't see it to be all hunky-dory and peaceful, but I don't see that kind of large-scale conflict either, because like I was saying, I think there's because there's so much change, like people are not constant as with what's happening in their lives, and people move and change. I think what we're likely to see a lot of instability, things shifting here and there, things changing, issues becoming very big, issues dying out, and so on. But I don't see this as a large scale conflict. I also don't think that there's enough unity amongst the different groups for there to be large scale conflict. Like I think there's a lot of fractiousness and change and movement in these groups themselves for there to be a large scale conflict.
Thank you so much, Ammara. Thank you for taking the time out and talking to me. And, I would really appreciate if you have some links or some material that you can share with me, which is relevant to the kind of things that we were talking about. I would love to, sort of do my bit of reading before I start writing about it.
Sure. So is it blasphemy stuff that you'd be? I'll send you some recent work that I've done on middle classes, just to kind of give you a sense of what I mean by middle class life.
Yeah.
It's mostly about marriages, but you can, use it in as you see fit, I guess. But it has stuff on middle classes. But I'll send you some stuff on blasphemy, maybe, because that's what you seemed interested in. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Actually,